Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jose Salas. I am a first-year full-time MBA student and panel director of today's final presentation. This panel is titled Latin America Society, Why the Middle Class Matters. Over the past decade, the middle class in Latin America has grown 50% from approximately 100 million to 150 million, and now represents 30% of the world population according to the World Bank. Better access to quality education and reliable safety nets have also played an important role in lifting Latin Americans out of poverty and into the middle class. However, even as people enter this segment with increased savings and access to credit, they are still vulnerable to fall back into poverty. Our moderator and panelists will explore the main challenges that the middle class encounters, how the growing middle class can become a catalyst for inclusive growth, and discuss the opportunities, challenges, and implications for businesses seeking to cater to the needs and desires of the middle class. The distinguished speakers on this panel include Martin Breitspacher, MBA class of 1998, Chief Operating Officer at Azteca America, Inc., Gianna Reams, Principal at McKinsey Global Institute, and Hernan Uribe, MBA class of 1992, Board Director and former Chief Financial Officer at Ripley Corp in Chile. The panel will be moderated by Tracy Lewis, West Region International Director at UPS, one of the sponsoring organizations of today's conference. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for hanging out on a Friday afternoon, kind of late on a Friday afternoon. So I appreciate you staying, and certainly to the panelists here, appreciate your time on a Friday afternoon, and hope you're enjoying this nice weather we have. If you came from somewhere else, I know a few of you did. So.
Yes.
So we have three very distinguished panelists today, and they have very unique backgrounds with an immense amount of knowledge and expertise on this topic. And Martin comes as a result of the acquisition of 12 new stations in the United States. He was appointed Chief Operating Officer of Azteca America in March of 2014. He served as the Chief Executive Officer of the same company in 2007, from February 2011 to March 2014. He joined Azteca America in 2007 as a Director of Financial Analysis before being appointed CFO less than a year later. So he progressed pretty rapidly through a series of increasingly responsible roles based on a strong financial background, as well as operation and organizational leadership skills. Before joining Azteca, Martin held a financial key and risk management position in the banking industry. So welcome, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yana Remes is a principal at McKinsey Global Institute. I know we're all very, very familiar with the McKinsey Institute. Brings us a lot of the knowledge that we have. And Dr. Remes is a business and economic research arm based in San Francisco. So since 2003, she's led MGI's research and productivity, urbanization, competitiveness, and growth. She's led research agendas on cities and the shifting economy, economic power of the city, the rising urban consuming class, and the shifting global company landscape, as well as the patterns of urban growth across America. So it comes with a great deal of expertise on this subject. And then Hernan, I'm going to butcher this, but Uribe.
Uribe.
Yeah, got it. An executive member of the board of directors of Ripley Corp, a Chilean corporation in the retail banking and shopping mall in Chile and Peru. His extensive experience in finance and previously served as chief financial officer of Ripley, Ultramar, and Cristalerías, Chile. As an investment banker, he was part of a team that advised the Chilean government in the privatization of the ports and water industry in the late 90s. At that time, he also was a part-time professor of corporate finance at the Universidad Católica de Chile. So welcome to all three of you, and thank you.
Thank you, Tracy.
So I just want to give you just a couple of kind kind of notes about this. First of all, I don't know if Judy's still here, but I wanted to let her know that I'm very happy to announce that the president of UPS in Latin America is a female. So, exactly. In a very male-dominated industry. So I'm very pleased to announce that. But really, some remarkable changes have happened in Latin America. After 2 decades of really not a lot of change in the area of the middle class, it's nearly doubled. So 1 out of 3 individuals in Latin America are now considered middle class, and that's pretty remarkable growth in a relatively short amount of time. And so the first question that I want to pose to the panel, and I'll pose the same question to all 3 of you, is what are the main challenges that the middle class in Latin America face, both with government policies, access to financing, which we spoke about, and then higher education as well? And so let's, ladies first, right? We'll start with Anna.
Thank you. Well, I think there's a lot to celebrate on the middle class story in Latin America. According to whatever your measure of middle class is, there are many out there, and I have mine, but we don't need to talk about that. I think they all consistently are very positive. And there's a lot of things we can thank for that. There is the resource boom. There's been increased debt for consumers and companies in many parts. But most importantly, it really has been a policy success. This is a region that has innovated on anti-poverty measures, such as the conditional transfer programs, that really have ushered a massive amount of people across the poverty threshold. And that really is great news. And the question is, what can we expect in the future? How much of that will continue? And that comes to some of the challenges that we will face going ahead. And unfortunately, not only are some of these tailwinds, like the resource boom or the increasing debt, even the capacity of many of the governments, because of their financial constraints, to sustain these anti-poverty programs, all of these are slowing down, as you well know. But more fundamentally, there really is a challenge in our capacity to sustain the progress for 2 reasons. One of them is that a lot of the progress up to now has been really pushing a bulge of people across the $10 threshold, which is a typical, or whatever your poverty threshold is, or middle class threshold is. So it has been really pushing that bulge across that frontier. But we haven't seen income growth on the middle class itself. When you look at the income growth, for example, in Brazil, it has been a little over 1% a year in the last 20 years. In Mexico, it has been 0.6%. This is 1/3 or 2/3 of the global income growth, despite the fact that we start from a relatively low income. So what we are really seeing is that we are seeing middle class that is bulging at the, if you want, the bottom end, and we don't see a dynamic movement and rise of incomes towards the higher income segments, and that would then usher, if you want, and pull the long tail ahead to the middle class. And that really is the big challenge ahead. And it really is a productivity challenge, as we heard from the previous panel. And unfortunately, productivity has been a core research area for us. And the more we look at it, the more worrisome it is from the perspective of the middle class. So take Mexico, which despite NAFTA and many of the reforms over the last 20 years, has really had a very flat productivity performance. This doesn't mean that there's been nothing happening. It really, the large companies have raised their productivity very rapidly. Almost 6% a year. Very nice performance, even by East Asian standards. When you look at the small companies, less than 10 employees, productivity has plummeted by 6% a year. And unfortunately, it is this segment that is growing in employment. In many ways, the large companies are growing, but they are not growing fast enough to gain share. They're growing with the employment pool growth, if you want. 20% has been the constant rate. And between these 2 segments, we are seeing a hollowing middle. We really are seeing the number of people employed in mid-sized companies decline. And that really is the fundamental economic challenge for Latin American middle class. We are able to use policies to reduce poverty, but we haven't found a way to really raise productivity and create well-paid middle-class jobs that will sustain that growth going forward. And that is the biggest challenge. And unfortunately, it is not just a question of something for social policies, which in themselves are very, very important. It is a critical growth question for companies as well. Up to now, in Mexico, for example, for the last 20 years, 2 percentage points of GDP growth has come from purely expanding population, expanding number of consumers, expanding number of workers. That is going down with the population growth. And unless productivity growth increases, we are seeing GDP growth and market growth decline significantly. So for that reason, I think we are all on this challenge of the middle class challenge for Latin America together. It will influence everyone involved, and the businesses as much as many other parts of the community.
Thank you. Martin.
I'm going to take a little bit different approach to what you answered. It's kind of, we need to understand really the evolution of the middle class in Latin America and what has happened in the last 2 decades. As we know, middle class in the US has really been the foundation of civilization and economic growth, as you said. In Latin America is different. Latin America countries are regarded as poor countries, and we have seen a shift in the last 20 to 30 years. And I think that it's important to understand how to define what the middle class and what these factors have played, the role they have played in order to create a middle class in Mexico and Latin America. So, and this again ends up in really the challenges that we're facing, how to continue with the growth of the middle class. I think the most important factor that I see is the fertility rates that have decreased dramatically in Latin America. For example, in Mexico, fertility rates have decreased from 7.7 children per mother in the 60s to almost 2.05 currently. And that's very important because the number of working people is now higher than the dependents. And that creates a shift in terms of opportunities. Second is really education. Education has also changed during the last 20 years. Mexico, for instance, there's a public school system which is not as the U.S. public system. It is really run by the government, and it's a very deficient school system. But what you have seen in the last year, for instance, is a 30% growth in the number of private institutions. And that tells you that education it has become a driver for the middle class. The fact that you have reduced fertility rates where your children now are available to go to school. In the past, you used to have like the household who used to work, 7 children, mother, really, they had really no chance to send somebody to school. Mobility was really non-existent. Having fewer children allows you to have more opportunity to send your children to school. I think the third factor here is remittances. Remittances from the US, especially for Mexico, are really very, very important and have created economic growth. Families who receive remittances usually tend to save a little bit more, and that increases their purchasing power. And last but not least, I think, which is mobility. And mobility is very important and can be defined in different ways, but I think, for instance, the access to internet has been a great boom and a great help for the middle class because it provides people the access to see other worlds, to see how other people live, and really what they want to achieve. And you also have education through internet. So people also can get out of these cities. For instance, now you have 60% of Mexico, 65% I think from Mexicans, they're able to move out of their city at least once a year they travel. So I think that there is the emergence of the middle market. It is there. I think the challenge is how do you continue with this growth? How do you continue funding education in order for people to grow into this middle class?
That's, yeah.
Well, I think that the importance of the middle class is paramount for Latin America, because I would say that 15 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, when you had 50% of the people which were poor, they elected most of the governments which were promising them heaven, and they'd say, well, if there is a change, I'm going to be better off than what I'm today. I think that the growth in Latin America has been responsible for the growth of the middle class. I don't think that there's been nothing really specific done by the governments to increase the middle class, rather than to grow the economy and to have specific policy to get the poor people into a better position. And I think that if the biggest challenge is to have the Latin American people continuing to elect governments which have a responsible policy, which are not populists. If you look across the Latin America, you don't see one reality. You see countries which have been growing at a very high pace, and countries which have really gone backwards, which have increased the number of poor people, and where, for example, countries like Venezuela, where the situation today is very, very difficult. So I think that the biggest challenge will be to continue to have good governments, good responsible governments, which are really keeping the rules of the game stable, so that business can develop. Keeping the government small, so there is less corruption, and having the private sector provide most of the goods, as it is in developed countries.
Right.
Yeah? The biggest problem I think that we've had in Latin America is that the state and the government promises the people that they don't have to work, they'll get better lives, through subsidies and through public services, they'll be better off. And I personally don't think that that's the way. I think that the countries which have progressed more are the countries which have had a stable macroeconomic policy, and the ones which have realized that you cannot progress in 1 or 2 years. You have to have a long-term policy in order to gain development. And you can look at the United States and know what the answers to development are education, good policy, macroeconomic policy, and letting the private sector do its work. If we realized that the countries which have done well can continue to do this for many years, I think that the middle class will be really huge in Latin America.
I agree, and we've all talked about a lot today about the access to higher education. And so I want to take that. I read something just a few weeks ago about really the government's responsibility in policy and taxation. Taxes are the lowest anywhere that they are in Latin America. And so there was some discussion and debate going back and forth about raising taxes in order to subsidize some of the access to higher education and student loans. What are your thoughts about that? I'd like to hear from all of you on that.
I think that's a question for Chile,
Yeah.
directly, given what's going on there.
Well, we just had a tax reform. There's been a lot of debate in Chile where the taxes were low or they were high. I think that the majority of the people thought that taxes were in general low. Yeah. I think a lot of the people looked at the corporate taxes, not the overall burden of taxes that you had in the economy. My personal thought is that the taxes were not that low. Anyway, the problem I think that happened in Chile is that not only they raised taxes, which you could have said, okay, let's raise taxes by 10% or 20%, but they changed the whole taxing system. And that is where I don't agree that President Bachelet has been so successful in these reforms, because one thing is to raise the taxes, and the other thing is to change the whole taxing system. When you raise taxes, well, you have to pay more, and there is a transfer to the government, and that's it. But when you change the taxing system, there is a knowledge that was in the country, which is how do you pay your taxes, which is destroyed. And I think that that's happened. I think that in general, if you look at the countries who have less taxes, they get more investment, they get more developed, and if you have a higher growth, if you have more profits in the companies, you end up paying more taxes in
Right.
absolute terms, but with lower tax percentages, I mean, charged to the companies. And I think that that's what the government should be looking for, to raise more money, to collect more money, but with growth.
It is certainly it's a debatable topic from both perspectives. Martin?
I think that Mexico poses a very different problem. I think it's not the issue, in my personal opinion, of raising taxes or lowering taxes. I think that it's an issue of a tax reform, making sure that everybody pays taxes, and then in addition, corruption gets into play. Because if I'm paying my taxes, okay? I live in a house and there's a hole in the street that gets fixed. In Mexico, you don't know where your money goes. So there is a vicious cycle where you're saying, why would I pay taxes if they're going to steal the money and they're not going to invest it? So I think that they still need to figure out how to solve that issue. And once they can do that, in that respect, then you will have higher investment in different institutional education. But I think that I have seen many people, they don't want to pay tax or just avoid paying taxes through different schemes, financial schemes or different companies, because really they don't believe in the government making good use of those taxes.
Well, you have talked about the tax side. I'll talk about the spending money on education. I'm not an education expert, but I have colleagues who have studied that a lot. And you can also just look at the OECD PISA scores, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. And I also happen to come from Finland, which typically ranks very high on those scores. So I'm an expert just by having gone through the Finnish schooling system. But when you look at money spent as a percentage of GDP across the OECD countries, it's actually one of the many areas where the money spent actually doesn't correlate very closely with any kind of outcomes. So in that sense, for example, Mexico is a nation where the money spent, it spends relatively high share of its GDP on education, but the returns are very, very weak. So I think money alone is clearly not the solution for improving education. And when you look at the high-performing education systems around the globe, whether it's Singapore or Finland or many others, it often has a lot to do with factors such as teacher quality, teacher training, and teacher motivation. So simply raising taxes for education is potentially not only not helpful, but it can be even harmful unless you do the other side, which is really improve the management and improve the quality of how schools are run.
Right. That's a good point. Money is not the solution to everything. I have a question for Martin. What role in talking about education, what role does the media play in educating the growing middle class?
In my personal opinion, it plays a major role, especially in Mexico, where you have a duopoly in terms of television. You have Televisa and you have TV Azteca. And the cable penetration in high contrast versus the US is only like 20 to 30%. Here in the US, you have a cable penetration of almost 70 to 80%. So what happens is that in Mexico, you don't have any other choices as watching over-the-air TV. And there you have really two companies that provide a programming for you. So education has become a key in terms of our, especially for Azteca in Mexico, it has become a key in programming. How do we educate people? How do we provide them tools to understand how they can improve their lives, their financial situation? And of course, it has to be done in a very subtle way, because you have to make a program that is interesting, right? If you put a class of how to make more money, maybe nobody's going to watch you, and you still are measured by ratings, and you have to sell. But for instance, we have a program that's called Lo que callamos las mujeres. Lo que callamos las mujeres really, it's a 1 hour episode that typifies a problem of women that face in Mexico and how they can improve. And that right there, you have a way of teaching the middle class different ways of how they can either educate themselves, what institutions they can access. So there's a lot of information, and every day there's a different topic. Novelas is it's another example. Novelas or soap operas in the past used to be the typical story, right? You have the poor girl who falls in love with a rich guy, and then there's another girl who fights and blah. Today, they're really demanding more content that is relevant to the middle class in Mexico. So novelas have to be first smarter. The plots have to be more interesting. So it's not, you still have to have your triangle, love triangle, it's always there because that's the way you write a novela and you make people watch a novela. But it's very different, the topics that you use, the settings that you use. And by doing that, that's, I think, the way we educate the middle class.
Interesting. Very interesting. I didn't think about a novella as being something that is educational.
There's actually research on that, of its economic development impact on women in India, for example. There's academic research on that, on the novella.
Excellent. See? This is what you could be doing, watching novellas. Helps you out, right? Hernan, a question for you. So what role do large multinational or multi-industry institutions play in the growth of the middle class? And then the second part of that is, do they have a responsibility to the middle class?
Well, at least in Replay, I mean, we sell most of our things, and our products are marketed to the middle class. So the middle class is our biggest client. The middle class has changed a lot. We have a huge responsibility. First, to know how they behave, what they are, what are their interests, what are their needs. Let me sort of give you an example of how selling to the middle class has been, especially in the financial industry, for example. We have banks in Chile, in Peru, and in Colombia. This story was told to me by the CEO of the company, who is actually one of the controlling families. He belongs to the controlling family of Replay. And when he was 10 years old, he was with his father in the Replay store. It was a very small store, and they sold suits. And this man comes in the store and wants to buy a suit, and he is watching what his dad is doing, and he says, well, this suit is very expensive, and his dad says, well, you can sell it to you in 3 installments, 1 down payment and 2 monthly installments. And the guy said, oh, okay, so I'll buy it. And he buys the suit and goes off. And then the current CEO of the company asks his father, well, did you know this guy before? And he says, no, but then why did you lend him money? You know? And he says, well, because the cost of the suit was 1/3.
I like it.
Yeah, and that's the way the business was done before. You know, maybe 20 years ago we started with a credit card,
right.
Which you could use only in the store. Today we have a MasterCard. We sell MasterCards and Visas, and we give consumer loans and through banks, formal banks, and the credit process obviously is very similar from a credit process that you would have here in the US. And what we are developing is we are developing a full consumers bank with all the products that a middle income person needs. But it has to be inexpensive. Yeah, it has to be simple. For example, the middle class person don't write checks, and, which are very expensive to operate, and they have this debit card. So they need a debit card, they need a credit card, they need a consumer loan, an overdraft account, 5 things, savings account, and we have to provide that. If we don't do it, yeah, maybe we have given them access. 20 years ago, they are our customer, but they'll go to bank somewhere else. So we have a huge responsibility. For example, also, financial products are very complicated, in the sense that, I don't know, 95% of the population does not know how to calculate the interest rate. Yeah. So we have to make it simple for them to know what are the installments and how to compare. And here there's also a government role in the sense that the government needs to regulate the industry and to at least give the people 2 or 3 price points where they can compare loans and how the installments would be, for example, for 36 months. And then it would be easy to compare a loan by Replay or by Falabella or by another bank. So when you design the process of selling the product, when you design the product, when you decide how to, you have to be thinking of these kind of people.
And I have a similar question for you. So what roles do these multi-industry institutions play in the, or I'm sorry, what role do multinational industries play in furthering the growth of the middle class?
Multinational companies are very important in Latin America. They're actually more important there than they are in many other emerging markets. When we looked at the share of large, over $1 billion revenue companies, Latin America actually has a much higher presence of multinationals. So when we think of the middle class and continue the growth of middle class through good jobs that provide you not just a pay, but also training and education that makes you more productive and more capable of doing new things, multinationals have a real potential to play a role in the region. I think they have in the past. When you look at, for example, companies that are coming, whether it's in Querétaro or many other regions, for example, the automotive clusters that have been there for a long time, they have built a pool of skills, and previously, not as much as we would have liked to, supply chains around them. But I think right now there's been a big change in many of these clusters that actually the multinationals, because of the increasing trade relationships with Mexico, where you can increase the scale of the market, they have actually invested heavily on building those supply chains. So really, I think the main role that multinationals can play in improving the middle class is truly from the employment, skilled building, networking, from the supply side, if you want, of the economic wealth that will then translate as income to those folks.
Thank you. Martin, one more question for you, and this one I find is fascinating to me. So what middle class related cultural shifts or trends have you been able to reflect in your programming?
I think it goes very much in line with what discussed in the previous question. I think that it depends on the type of programming that you're showing. So there's the basic programming that is not going to change. And then again, there's other programming like where the novelas, again, where you can really adapt them as you see middle class progressing. Because at the end, you need to understand who's your target audience. And what has happened in Mexico is, for instance, right now, there is a triangle where they classify the different classes by letters, right? So you have the AB, for instance, which is the top class, no? And then you have the C plus, C, D plus, and D. And D being really the poor, D plus being below average, C being average, and C plus being a little bit above average. And what happens is that you really realize is how the percentages are shifting between these different classes. And what's happening in Mexico is now 56% is comprised of the C and D plus, which is your middle class. So all of a sudden you have to be catering to that market segment, which is very different than the market segment you used to have 20 years ago, where really the bulk of the population lied on your D and D plus. So you have to adapt the type of program that you're doing really to cater and make sure that these people are watching what you're doing. And to add a second degree of difficulty is that as this middle class now has access to internet, as they didn't have before, now you're open to a new way of programming options. So now you're not only competing with Televisa, now you're competing also with other platforms as to what you want to see. So you have to make sure that whatever programming you're showing still targets that big audience. Because at the end you have to match your target audience with your advertisers that want to advertise in your network, and make sure there is a match, because they want to spend money, they're targeting an audience, and you better make sure that your targeted audience that they want to target.
Right. That's it. That just seems fascinating to me, that the shifts in cultures also shifts trends, and then the advent of internet and the YouTubes of the world, if you will, kind of changes make significant programming changes for you.
For instance, there was a case where, in the past, we used to produce other novelas, Azteca or Televisa. And now what we're seeing is that there's some very good novelas from Brazil, very good novelas from Turkey, that are really relevant to the Mexican population. And what we're doing is really taking those novelas and just translate them. We're not some we reproduce. There was one from Chile, actually, Las Bravo was called in Mexico, which is a very funny story, but we just took from Canal 13, we took the story and just rewrote it, Mexicanized it a little bit, but really it's showing you there is a mobilization and there's really an appetite for people to see something different. And that's kind of the mobilization I was talking earlier about how the middle class is getting access to different cultures, different way of living, and these novelas are really appealing to them.
It's fascinating to me. Hernan, I have a question for you. So what are the challenges experienced by the banking sector in Banco Ripley in servicing the middle class? What are your goals looking forward?
Well, as I was telling you, I mean, we are building a consumer's bank, and the main challenges today are that the middle class is empowered in the sense that they are demanding good products. They are demanding lower interest rates. They have access to 2 to 3 banks before they didn't have access to banks. Some of the poorer people are afraid to go into a formal bank. Yeah. So we as retailers are used to selling in a store, so our banks look more like a store. They're always with the doors open, and they're very clear, different than the banks that you have to open the door and people are afraid to cross in. But I would say that the main challenges are to continue keeping those customers once they start growing and they can go to a formal bank, because they don't just need access, they need good quality of the products. The other thing is also influencing policy, because in the case of Latin America, there's been a drive of reducing maximum interest rates without taking into account that there is a lot of costs in banking to people with small income, because when you are making big loans, yeah, you can charge a very small interest rate. But when you're making a very small loan, even if the interest rate sounds high, in terms of an absolute amount of money to spend, for example, for collection, or to spend answering the phone or sending a bill or whatever, it's not a big amount. So some of the governments, for example, in Colombia, they have a very, very low interest rate as a maximum interest rate. So the banking industry has not developed for the lower income people. In Chile, the maximum interest rate had been higher, so there was a bigger development, and now they've reduced them, and a part of the population which were the higher risk were basically thrown out of the system. And once you are not able to access even a higher interest rate loan, you have to go to a prestamista or an informal financing institution. You can say institution for informal, and the way in which they collect or the interest rates that they charge are totally outrageous. You know? So I think that we need governments and regulators to understand these issues and not be so theoretical. Many of them are economists, but which have not worked in a business, so they don't understand that basically business people react to stimuli.
Right.
If I can add very quickly to that, Grupo Salinas also owns Electra, which is very similar to what you guys have. They also own banks. And I think another issue is the perception. And what has happened to us in Mexico is that as Banco Azteca opened, and in conjunction with Electra, we had we used the stores as the banking. What happened is you have a perception that Electra targets low income class. So middle class will not go to Electra because they have the perception that it's targeted to the low class. So how do you now make Banco Azteca also appealing to the middle class? And the answer is that you don't. What we did is we're creating another bank, which is a different brand, trying to target that middle class, because it's very difficult to change the perception of the people once they know that Electra, which is a great bank and it's very profitable. But again, it's targeted to the low class. So
Middle class. Interesting. Well, I think we'll open it up to we'll go with you right here.
Is the growth of the middle class, especially Mexico, Martin, because I'm familiar with Mexico, is the growth of the middle class a real or perceived threat to the upper class?
in my personal opinion, no. I think that the upper class in Mexico is still a very selective and it's a very small class. It has been always like that. The issue is that in the past you would have a very small middle class, small upper class, small middle class, huge lower class. I think it's not because the means that the upper class have and what has the wealth that they have accumulated through time, it's very difficult for the middle class to do that. It's going to take a lot of years. So in my opinion, it's not a threat, but I think that it helps the whole country in terms of economic growth.
I'm thinking also of Guatemala. In Guatemala, you know, there's a upper class that controls everything. They control the finances, the banks, they control the voting, they control everything. And as the middle class starts growing, now they have some power. So they're taking away from the upper class. Same thing happened in Mexico.
Where you do see that, I think it's more in politics. And I think that the perfect example of that was when Calderón beat López Obrador in the past election before Peña Nieto. Where Calderón, there was, of course, several factors that made him win. But one thing that he did realize, and he did very, very well, is he understood the importance of the middle class and the emergence of the middle class. And he catered to them. So even if there was somebody that was ruling for López Obrador, which who doesn't know, López Obrador was the left party, even if they were ruling for López Obrador, they were voted for Calderón because Calderón proposed a better economic solution for the middle class. And I think that was key in one of the things that he won. So yes, they can exercise more power, and that especially in government, and as you said, having better governments, okay, making sure that the money is well spent, yes. Threat to the upper class, you still have in Mexico how many families control the country. It's very similar still to Guatemala.
We have one back here.
I can take that one. I can respond in English, though, I assume. Well, I think I don't think there is a way to separate the income and the consumption purchasing power. I think in general, I think creating jobs, I think, is the biggest challenge for jobs that are attractive, well-paid, trained, and productive. I think that's the biggest challenge for Latin America. On purchasing power, actually, there's one thing that hasn't come up here, which is actually a very important one, particularly for the case of Brazil. Consumers in Latin America, and Brazil in particular, but I think across the region, pay much higher prices than American consumers, for example, not just relative to their income, but in absolute terms, for example. A Toyota Corolla in market exchange rate costs 3.5 times in Brazil what it does here. Similarly, I mean, there are some examples where you have multiples of costs, and these are oftentimes aspirational goods. For example, even certain brand tennis shoes or PlayStations. These are aspirational goods that even relatively low-income households want. So that is a huge tax at the bottom of the income distribution. So if you want to really do the best for the middle class, it is to raise better jobs and raise incomes, while at the same time making sure that the cost to consumers are reduced. And there's a number of reasons for that. A lot of in the case of Brazil, for example, it's the multiple tax layers that are often the factor. But we can work on both of those sides. But to your question about whether rising middle class is bad for the poor, I think all the evidence suggests that's never the case. I can even tell you an example in the US. When you look at the opportunities of the lowest quintile of actually rising to the top quintile, so basically the mobility index, the regions that do the best are the ones where the middle class lives close to the lower income segments. The regions that do very well is ones that one wouldn't necessarily expect. It is those regions where middle class is close to the lower income segments. It is in a way, it matters less what happens with the highest income segment. And I think that's very much true in Latin America. Middle class is the one that, if you think of the goat in the boa that works its way through and creates opportunities on markets and financial sectors, etc., that then allows other people to enter behind them.
Thank you. And I made a commitment to her that I would get her out on time to go catch a flight. So I want to thank all of you for hanging. You were tough and hanging on a Friday night. Thank you.